or to this computer. Okay, so welcome back to our third interview here. And where we left off last time, you were getting ready to, you were just graduating from the Citadel. Where did you go after graduating from the Citadel?
Well, the good old Army sent me a telegram that I got right after I received my diploma from General Mark Clark. And that telegram said, Lieutenant Kerr, we expect you at Fort Jackson, South Carolina by 6 o'clock tonight, which was not what my original order said. I got my full orders in November of 64, which told me what I'd be doing for the first 6 months in the Army.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be going to Fort Jackson. I'd be going to Fort Knox. I'd be going to Fort Benning, da 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 da, and then I go to Germany. So I didn't get any leave. You might not remember because you were so young, but I went off to Fort Jackson. Pop said, you got 2 beers and 2 hours with this party, and then you're going to start going to Fort Jackson. So that's how I got to Fort Jackson. And when I got there, I signed into the marksmanship committee of the 3rd Training Brigade for basic training.
Mm-hmm.
And I became responsible for teaching these new recruits how to shoot
Mm-hmm.
and hit their targets.
Mm-hmm.
And I had 2 great sergeants that had been 2 tours in Vietnam, all special forces guys. And within a week, they had me well trained on how to give a military class, write a military lesson plan, and give instruction to students. So that's how I got to Fort Jackson. I was only there for a little over a month.
Mm-hmm. And what came next?
Well, the next thing I went to was I got to Fort Jackson in May, and the 4th of July, after the 4th of July weekend, I had to sign into Fort Knox, Kentucky. That
Mm-hmm.
was the home of the armor branch,
Mm-hmm.
tanks, whatever. And I was commissioned an armor officer.
Mm-hmm.
So first thing you do as an armor officer, brand new, you go to the armor basic officer course.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes by physical year, but I won't go into all that stuff. So I went to Fort Knox, Kentucky, and learned all about, stuff I didn't see before, like the M551 Sheridan, which I didn't see until I got to the 82nd in 1976.
Mm-hmm.
And here it was 1965.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, uh, so that's where I went, and I didn't get any leave from that school until we graduated, and then we got a week's leave, and I went home
Mm-hmm.
uh, and spent time with Susan. Uh, uh, we we decided that let's see, what day was that? I don't remember when I went to Fort Benning, but I went to Fort Benning first for jump school,
Mm-hmm.
which was on my orders.
Right.
And then I was supposed to go 3 days later after graduation. I was supposed to start Ranger School.
Mm-hmm.
So Susan and I got engaged on Labor Day, 1965.
Mm-hmm.
Official ring, all that stuff. Uh, and we've been talking a little bit about the marriage. So we decided that Ranger School ends the end of February.
Mm-hmm.
And so I can take 2 weeks leave before I go to Germany, and we should plan on getting married as soon as I start that leave as possible in Huntington.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the best thing we could do. And there were a couple of reasons for that. Number one, I wanted to go over with my girlfriend, and I wanted to make sure that the Army would pay for her plane ticket and all her goods that she was going to bring with her.
Right. Dennis,
And they only do that if you're married.
okay. How was it you ended up how did you end up in Germany? Was that by choice or that was just where the Army sent you?
That's where the Army, my original orders, but from
Right.
November 64,
Right.
said you will report to the 2nd Squadron, 14th Cav Regiment in Germany as soon as you finish the courses that we have set up for you.
Okay.
So
So
I knew in November I was going to Germany.
okay. And that was just where the Army, did that have to do with the fact that you had declared you wanted armor? Is that why that determined where you were going to go?
that probably had a lot to do with it. Plus, I had with the ROTC people, I had pretty good grades because I was first in their ROTC program at
Right.
that summer camp the year before.
Okay.
Not the year before, but a couple months before.
Yeah. So your marriage is an interesting story in itself, which I'll get to a little bit later on. But you ended up in Germany. That was not a surprise to you. You ended up in Germany because you were declared that you wanted to specialize in armor. So I get that. And all these places you went to after you graduated were all part of the getting you ready for that assignment. Is that a good summary?
Getting me ready for the Army and getting me ready to be an armor officer. Yeah.
Okay. Now you were in Germany I would say, again, I was a little kid, but the whole Cold War was hot and heavy at that point. As I recall, wasn't Bad Kissington pretty close to the border of East Germany?
Yeah, not too far. Yeah.
Okay. What was it like being bearing in mind where we were with the Cold War, what was it like being on the so close to the East German border?
Well, I was part of what they call a squadron, which is like a battalion. And we had we had 3 ground cav troops, that's a company. We had 1 tank troop, which is a company. We had a howitzer battery that had an artillery rounds that shot nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a headquarters. So it was a big size unit. And we had 2 border camps that we were responsible for along the east-west German border. And actually, the one closest to Coburg, which is north of where we were, south of where we were, part of the border included part of Czechoslovakia.
Mm-hmm.
So, so we had 2 border camps, and every 3 or 4 months, your whole unit moved out and occupied 2 base camps,
mm-hmm.
one close to one closest to your home headquarters, and the other one off near Coburg. And so you took your whole unit out there. So you were the first defense of, not only did you patrol the border, you had all your vehicles, ammo, and everything else out there, because if the flag went up, you happened to be in one of the most direct lines of attack that the East Germans and Russians would use. You've heard of the Fulda Gap. Right. Well, it was also Highway 19, which was actually part of the Fulda Gap. And that was the main avenue of approach into Germany, West Germany, by the Soviets and the East Germans.
And you mentioned there were tactical nuclear weapons. Was the plan, if they crossed the border, to use those weapons?
Well, in given direction, yeah. Okay. I was the nuclear employment officer, and I wasn't even in that unit. Mm-hmm. That's because I had a top secret clearance, and I had gone to a special school that they sent me to. So,
were you allowed to discuss that? Was that something you could discuss with Susan, or was that something it was basically you're not supposed to talk?
Well, we also along the main route that we guarded, mm-hmm. was a route called Highway 19, which was a high-speed road. Mm-hmm. But of course, it was boarded off. When you got close to the border, the first signs you'd start seeing were what they called the 5-kilometer signs. Mm-hmm. 5K zone is what they called it. And you weren't allowed to go into that zone unless you had official military business.
Right.
So there were many times we caught, GIs going in there, because the closer you got to the border, the nicer the Germans were. Mm-hmm. I never bought a beer when I was out there at the border camp. I'd stop at Walbach and all these other little towns, go into a guest house, get a free schnitzel and a beer.
Okay. So I think you anticipated my next question, but before I get to how you got along with the German people. So the question, obviously, even though they're tactical nuclear weapons, when I hear nuclear, that raises a kind of a threshold. I mean, if they crossed the border, then the plan was to use nuclear weapons.
Well, it was an option. Right. We also had along that Highway 19 on our side of the border, which went right up against what they called the 100-meter. They had a 5-kilometer zone. They had a 1-kilometer zone. They had a 100-meter zone. a
Right.
50-meter zone. And so our Highway 19, went right through that whole minefields and all this crap. And the Army had dug these caverns in the ground,
Mhm.
and they were there to place nuclear weapons once we got the word that the Soviets or East Germans were getting ready to move. So
Right.
there were like 5 of them that we were responsible for in our whole squadron area.
Right.
And when you were on the border, you didn't go get those nuclear warheads. Was stored at a special nuclear weapon site, which
Mhm.
I was also responsible for, back near our base camp back in Bad Kissimmee.
Right.
So we had both nuclear warheads for artillery, and we had nuclear weapons that would be bunker busters.
Right.
And the plan was when you set those off, you would blow a crater in the road, and on each side of that road were big, heavy tree lines. So
Right.
the armor would have trouble in their maneuvering very
Right.
quickly, towards the big areas in the rear.
Did that ever become that? Again, if it's a question you don't want to answer, it's fine. But did that become a conversation at home that you'd have with Susan in terms of the possibility of nuclear war with the Russians?
Well, they sent me to a nuclear biological and chemical school when I got to the squadron,
Mhm.
and that's one of the reasons I got all these extra jobs.
Right.
Those were extra duties.
But was that something? And I don't want to probe too deep into.
I didn't really talk too much to Susan. She came out to the border camp. We had border camp days where we invited the families and had a cookout
Right.
and all that kind of stuff. And we took them up to as close to the border to the 100-meter thing so they could see the barbed wire and the booby trap, the towers. The East Germans had towers.
Yep, I remember
We-
seeing pictures.
We used bunkers, and they flew their Hind helicopters, weekly up and down the border. We didn't have any attack aircraft. We had one old fixed wing, and we had 2 little scout planes. Because where were our helicopters and our fixed wing? They were going, or they were in Vietnam.
Mhm.
We
Okay.
were authorized a whole bunch of scouts and guns, but none were available.
Right.
We had in the whole area that I served in, we had very few UH-1 Huey helicopters
Right.
because they were in the units that went to Vietnam.
Yeah. You mentioned
So-
the closer you got to the border, the friendlier the Germans were. Was that?
Yeah, absolutely.
And was that out of fear of the Russians coming, or?
No, I think they appreciated the fact that we were helping to protect them, and they could concentrate on rebuilding after World War II.
Mhm.
Some of these places were, just getting the road repaved by 65.
Right.
Germany, most families didn't have a car. If they had a car, it was just one.
Mhm.
Now they got 3 cars,
Sure.
but they were really suffering from the war.
But the feeling they were fairly warm towards Americans and soldiers, particularly.
They were friendly, like in our hometown where the base camp was.
Mhm.
They were pretty friendly because we interacted with them,
Mhm.
and we included them in a lot of the discussions we had about whether we're going to put the ammo dump on this side of the base or that side of the base. And we tried to make public relations pretty important to us. Matter
Mhm.
of fact, we had a full-time German interpreter that served on our staff.
Uh-huh.
Matter of fact, she was at Mom's and I civil wedding that we had to have then by the mayor of the town.
All right, let's get to that in a moment. But you said earlier when I interrupted you that you actually had proposed to Susan before you went to Germany, and your plan was
Absolutely, because we thought we had planned on getting married. After jump school, I would go to Ranger school.
right,
And then after Ranger school, I was guaranteed at least 2 weeks vacation.
right,
And that's when we were planning on getting married in Huntington.
right. And then what
So that
changed that? What changed that?
I didn't go to Ranger school.
Oh, okay.
So instead, I got 3 days notice that I had to be in Germany in 10 days
Right.
instead of going across the field to the Ranger School. Another screw up by the assignments guy screwed me. They gave my Ranger slot, they call it, to somebody else
Right.
3 days before I was supposed to start.
Yeah. Okay. So tell me about, so basically what happened was then Susan had to come over for the wedding. Could you
She
just,
didn't have to. The second plan was okay. Uh, I tried to talk her into just a justice of the peace wedding
Mhm.
with no fringe benefits or all that, just a paperwork wedding. Uh, but the paperwork to the army would mean you were married.
Right.
And that way, I could go to Germany, get on the housing list as a married person, and get us a place on base, nice barracks, family dwellings, and then I would come home in February or March, and we'd have a regular wedding in Huntington,
Mhm.
and then we both could go back after we. My phones are ringing here.
Okay.
After we had our wedding, we'd go on a little honeymoon, and then head off to Germany together. And the army would pay for her plane ticket and all her goods to take with her. So when I got to Germany in November instead of March, they said, "Oh, they need lieutenants over here. They need lieutenants." Yeah, it's a bunch of bullshit. Uh, I got screwed so many times by the army. I should have left as a lieutenant, as a captain, anyway. The I get to Germany and I report in on a Saturday morning,
Mhm.
and they got what they call Saturday inspection. So I go in and report to the squadron commander, Colonel Noid, Noid, and he was a Korean hero, Silver Star and all these medals and all that. And he said, "Kerr, what are you doing here? I didn't expect you until late February, early March. I got 60 officers. I don't know what kind of job I can give you. Let me see." So he pulls out a loose leaf binder and he says, "Well, the first job I need is I need a new coach for the basketball team."
Mhm.
I said, "Seriously?" Then I told him about my orders being canceled at Ranger School, everything being screwed up. And I get over here and you offer me a basketball coach job? What's the next one on the list? He says, "Well, I see that you majored in business at the Citadel. How would you like to be the assistant club manager?" I
Mhm.
said, "Sir, I think you need to keep going down your list." So the next one, he said, "Well, we got a tank platoon that's going to be open next week." I said, "I'll take it."
Mhm.
He said, "You don't want to know what's else?" I said, "No, that you've gone far enough down the list."
Mhm.
So here I'm really pissed off because they told me they really need lieutenants in Germany. And I
Wow.
get there and he says, "How would you like to be our club manager, assistant club manager?" So my first job in Germany was commanding M60 tanks.
Mhm.
And I was tank platoon leader for a while. And I had asked him, would it be all right if I get to March and I go home for a couple of weeks and get married? He said, "Sure, you go home next week." I said, "Oh, geez, I'm finding all this stuff out now. Why didn't they tell me before I left? I would have got married before I came over here."
Right.
Anyway, had those Department of the Army orders. He had to follow those. And so the plan was, could I go home for 2 weeks in March? He said, "No problem." Well, what happens? He's there for a couple of months and he sort of gets relieved because one of the border camps was in terrible shape. But that border camp actually fell under what was called the Fifth Corps.
Mhm.
And I was under the Seventh Corps in war. In peacetime, where that border camp was, it was actually on the boundary of Fifth Corps. So Fifth Corps didn't want to put any money into a border camp. We got last priority. And the Seventh Corps, which was on my right, which we would be fighting for if the war started, they didn't want to give us money for a border camp that wasn't in their zone, you know. So this colonel got relieved, but he got kind of he didn't get yanked out of his job. He was there because they already identified a guy to replace him.
Mm-hmm.
And so the guy that came in to replace him got there before the change of command between those two guys. And I guess they had their sit down sessions on, okay, what's going on now? And this new lieutenant colonel coming in, Colonel Palmer, he knew everything that was going to happen for a while because he had been serving at a higher headquarters in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
He knew that there was going to be a tremendous drawdown to fill the units in the States to send to Vietnam.
Right.
So he knew that when I signed into that unit, there was 60 officers. In 2 months, there were 15.
Mm.
Now, that's quite a drawdown, when you think.
Yeah, I think so.
So word got back that, we can't let Kerr go to a 2-week home to get married. I got 15 officers, and one of them's a chaplain, one of them's a doctor, one of them's a dentist. And I forget, there were 4 that weren't combat guys.
Right.
So he's down to 11 combat guys where he usually has 50. So he said, you can't let him go home. Well, another punch in the face, but this wasn't Department of the Army. This was a local guy.
Right.
And so I'm calling Susan and writing Susan. And finally I said to her, this isn't fair to either of us, our engagement. I mean, I might not get home for 2 years.
Right.
So we got 2 choices. Well, we got 3. We can break off the engagement, which I really don't want to do. We can stay engaged and, I can wait a year or so and try to get married whenever they'll let me go home. Or you can come over here, we get married over here.
Mm-hmm.
She said, I'll call you back at this number, which was a joint number. And on such and such a time at such and such a date. And I'll give you my answer. So she calls me back, I don't know, a week later. She said, I'll be there in 2 weeks. Well, I said, this girl must really love me if she's going to leave Dan Rathgaber and his and his gang,
right,
and come all the way over to Germany. I'm sure Mom and Pop were just happy I was going to marry Susan. My father was worried. Our dad was worried that I was going to lose this girl,
right.
And he knew a good one when he met her, and he met her when we were 13 or younger. I don't know. But so that's what happened.
Okay.
But I couldn't get on a housing list because we weren't married.
Right.
So I had to find a place off post that would accept military people.
Right.
Because if they accepted military people, the military would allow that renter of that apartment to use some of the Army's furniture that they had in their warehouse or whatever. So I found a guy that was leaving, and he had a good apartment in a place called Arnshausen. So I rented that place a couple of weeks before Susan got there so I could start getting things organized.
Right. Was that the guy that you became you're still friendly with that family? With
well, the father, the husband and wife have passed away, but we still correspond with the family, yes.
No,
last time we went to Germany, we went and had lunch at one of their daughter's place, and the mother was still alive. But that was a number of years ago.
Okay. When we did the first interview, we started to talk about your faith life and how your faith life had informed your life, and also in terms of your Army career. Can you describe what your faith life was in Germany? Were there particular clergy there that you connected with or had an impact on you? Or
we had a squadron chaplain who was not Catholic. He was Christian. He was some Presbyterian. But we had a Catholic chaplain that we shared with a local post that wasn't too far away from us, and he was a Catholic. and he's the one that did our wedding, Father Flynn. And I would see him sometimes once a week, sometimes once a month. And we became pretty good friends. And he helped us a lot with getting this marriage thing settled, getting the chapel, getting everything organized, all equipment that they needed. I don't know.
So when you went to services every Sunday, where did you go? Was it on base, or would you go?
Yeah, we had a chapel on base. Yeah.
And Father Flynn would come in and say mass?
He would say mass. Yeah. I think there was just one man. Maybe he did two. He did at least one a week. And that's the one we would go to. Sue, did we have two masses on base at Bad Gissigan? She can't hear me.
That's okay.
Let's just say there was one.
Okay.
And it was like mid-morning, 10 o'clock or so.
Okay. So we're getting up near the end of our half hour here. I want to, again, obviously we'll eventually get to your 2 tours of Vietnam. But as you look back, how did your time in Germany, how did that impact, how did that, how did the Vietnam War, I think you already answered this question. So basically, as a result of the escalation in Vietnam, they basically stripped the officer corps there in Germany. So that was
and the senior NCOs.
Okay. What lessons did you learn in Germany that you applied in Vietnam? Your first tour?
Well, I definitely learned small unit leadership. I was a platoon leader with tanks. Then I was a platoon leader / executive officer in a tank unit. And then I was a troop commander, which is like company commander, with just one officer, me. Instead of 5, because the other 4 had been sent to Vietnam. And then I became the S2, the Squadron Intelligence Officer / Assistant S3, Operations Officer. And then you got to add on the other things. I was the Nuclear Employment Officer. I was responsible for the nuclear weapons site. It goes on and on and on. So what I learned there is small unit leadership, planning, how important planning is, particularly in the Army. And you got to plan not just for your training. You got to plan if you go into the border camp, what's the plan for the food? When it's going to be delivered? You got enough cooks? So putting all these logistics things together with shooting tanks was a pretty important part of learning the whole system of fighting a war. And so I did a lot of counseling. We had a lot of drug users, and they were all draftees. See, we still had a drafted army then.
Right.
So many of my soldiers were offered by the judge 3 years in the Army or jail. So I got them, and I would say 25% of my enlisted soldiers during the year or so I was a commander had some kind of disciplinary problem. And if it was drugs, in those days, you couldn't just throw them out of the Army. You had to do a compassionate reassignment to a different unit. So not only was I giving my bad soldiers to friends, they were giving their bad soldiers to me.
Right.
Because that's the way. The Army was so small over there, they
Right.
couldn't afford to throw these guys out of the Army.
Okay. Yeah.
So I learned the smaller unit leadership. I learned the whole big business about running an organization like my troop with 250 people in it, so there was logistics, there was food, there was people's leaves, there was, all kinds of stuff going on. Now, most of my soldiers, the NCOs, only about 8 of them were married and had their wives in Germany. The other guys that were married left their wives at home, which meant they only had a 2-year tour in Germany. If they took their wife to Germany, they had a 3-year tour. That was until the Vietnam War started. Then it cut back to 2 years. So regardless of whether you had your wife with you or not, it was a 2-year tour. As a matter of fact, when I got close to being close to 6 months for 2 years, a lot of the guys were getting sent to not U.S. units, but Vietnamese units as advisors. And I said, hell, I'm not going to be in the Army very long, but I sure as hell want to serve in a U.S. unit.
Mm-hmm.
The only way I can ensure that happens is I volunteer because they're going to send me anyway. I'm going to volunteer early and request the U.S. unit.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I did. And so my squadron commander said he didn't recommend that. He recommended I go to one of these Vietnamese units. I didn't get along real well with Palmer.
Mm-hmm.
Palmer was a guy, how much time we got?
Go ahead, 2 minutes.
Palmer was the kind of guy, VMI graduate,
Mm-hmm.
very, very prejudiced. And we'd have promotion boards, and the lieutenants ran the promotion boards because we didn't have any captains to speak of. You wouldn't send a chaplain to be in charge of a promotion board for a tanker or for reconnaissance or for mortars or whatever. So many a time I was the senior guy. I was the senior guy because I went on active duty before they did. We had the same date of rank, but that's just the way it was. And it worked out on me getting the right BOQ room, but it didn't work right on me with all the court martials we had going on. So we had a promotion board. I was president of the promotion board, and all the troop commanders were there, and the E6s were coming before us to be considered for E7s, that's platoon sergeant, for tanks or for scouts.
Mm-hmm.
And I had one of the best sergeants I had in the Army was an E6, and he wanted to make E7. And his primary MOS was tanks, and his secondary MOS was scouts.
Mm-hmm.
So he was considered, first we did the tank board, and then we did the scout board, interviewing these guys, reviewing their records and all that kind of stuff. And he came out number one in tanks of 15 guys that came up before us. And he came out 2 in reconnaissance.
Mm-hmm.
So we knew damn well he was going to get promoted because the squadron was going to get between 6 and 8 slots from the higher headquarters. And so I'm sitting in my office about 2 weeks later, and Sergeant Reeves is knocking on my door and he's crying. Come on in, Sergeant Reeves, close the door. What's going on? He said, sir, I didn't get promoted. I said, you got to be shitting me. How can you be number 1 and number 2 and you didn't get selected for either? No. I said, okay, let's go down and see the colonel. Colonel Palmer, VMI graduate. Sergeant Reeves, you can guess what his background was.
Mm-hmm.
He was a hardworking black sergeant.
Mm-hmm.
And so we knocked on the colonel's door. He said, hey, come on, what's going on? I said, sir, I don't understand this. I sat as the president on the boards, and Sergeant Reeves was first in tanks and second in reconnaissance, and you got guys you're promoting that were 8th and 9th on that list.
Right.
Sergeant Reeves, you're excused. So Sergeant Reeves leaves, and I'm in there alone. He has me close the door, and he starts chewing my ass. Who am I, as the first lieutenant, questioning his authority as a lieutenant colonel? I said, sir, I'm just going by what the rules are. The rules set down how you're supposed to have these boards, how you rate these people, and when you promote them.
Right.
He said, get the hell out of here. So I leave. Sergeant Reeves is waiting for me outside this squadron headquarters. And we're walking back up the company street to my unit.
Mm-hmm.
And these are old SS barracks. And I gave him a slip of paper. And that slip of paper had the Corps Equal Opportunity Officer,
Right.
his telephone number on it. Now the Corps, we went from squadron to Corps because we were a regiment. And I said, you can't ever tell anybody I gave you this stuff. But when we get back to my office, you use the phone and you call the Equal Opportunity Officer and talk to that lieutenant colonel or colonel, whichever he is, about what just happened to you.
Right.
So he's working out of the first sergeant's office. I'm sitting in my office, so I'm not hearing a conversation. He comes back in and he says, so those people up the Corps are pretty pissed off. I think this is going to work out. And so 2 days later, we both get called down to the colonel's office. The colonel pins E7 stripes on Sergeant Reeves, and he chews me out for complaining about this whole thing. And how did this all happen? Well, I never told him, you know, but this guy was terrible.
Sounds like you applied the lesson that you learned. They told me at the Citadel that you got to go by the book. You got to follow the rules, and they relate.
Yeah, absolutely. I was a rule follower.
Okay.
Now there were times I had to go a little bit to the right, a little bit to the left.
Okay.
But I never got out of the box except when it came to tactics.
Okay. So we're up at 36 minutes now, and just one point I want to make sure you understood. So basically, how you got from Germany to Vietnam is you volunteered under the assumption they were going to send you anyway, and you thought if you volunteered, they would give you a U.S. unit to work with.
And they did.
Good. Okay. Okay, we're going to end it here, and thank you very much. This was learned some things. That last story at the end, I had never heard the story about that sergeant, so I'm very proud of you, Dan. It's the right thing to do.
He's a great guy. He made command sergeant major.
Right.
You know, which is the top rank in the enlisted corps.
Yeah, and you've always had a special relationship with the sergeant majors, as I recall from your retirement dinner.
My senior NCOs particularly, yeah, but sergeant majors, like one of my sergeant majors just got selected to be in the 82nd Hall of Fame.
Oh, great.
I said, and so I'm waiting to hear when they're going to have that. I wrote a letter of recommendation for him.
Good.
I worked with him in the 70s, in the 80s, and in the 90s.
Yep. Okay.
So I knew him for.
Okay, I'm going to have to cut out. I'm going to stop recording here because we're up to 37 minutes. I promise to keep these for a half hour or less. So stop recording.